The following program may contain adult language and mature subject matter and does not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Join in right now. Send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you again today. And today, as usual, we are going to discuss a topic of interest. This one is particularly curious, and we're going to go into a discussion about what makes it curious. And, I want to encourage you, my dear listeners, who just asked the most incredible questions, to email us throughout the show in studio101@gmail.com. And I want to introduce shortly our guests today, David Coates, therapist, and Corey Kilpack, author, and I guess we'll call him ex-patient, something like that, right?
The subject.
Subject. They wrote a book called Be Less Dickish, the definitive self-help book about men. And, I have to tell you that I read this book, at least I read a fairly large portion of it, driving to and from the North Country, cottage country with my husband. We would, read it to each other and talk about the sections and why they're meaningful and what it really means. And some of the sections were pretty spicy, very well written, and kind of engaging when you think about the troubles that people can get into. And this is really about men. It's a male focus on the areas, what looked like to me, the areas where a man might get into trouble in their life, sometimes consciously, sometimes very unconsciously, until they get to a place where they're really doing that deeper dive into who they are, or have a great motivation to shift and change. And I really love that, because I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, you can't do anything, you can't improve, nothing's going to change here. But for me, given kind of the complexities of the clinic that I run, I see people struggling with all sorts of things. And I really always like to keep this open mind and a realization that, we're on the planet to really evolve and reflect on ourselves and, become who we're really supposed to be. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had, in this case, we'll say, a male patient say to me that they were very unhappy with their own behavior, maybe not using those words, but, maybe, as I said before, spicier words. And we're going to talk a little bit on the topic of spicy words in a moment, but we will get there shortly. Before we go there, I want to just start with a passage from the book, and then we're going to introduce David and Corey. When you're triggered to the point of terror, raw survival instincts take over completely. You have little, if any, conscious control over your experience. You lose logic and agency, even the ability to see. You freak, and here's that spicy word, out, and there's nothing funny about it. Your nervous system responds as though your life were at stake, and you will do anything, absolutely anything, to stop the terror. In normal conditions, our lives are not in danger on a moment-to-moment basis, but our brains are still wired to respond to primal threat. And I think that a lot of the kind of behavior that I hear about and that I see often comes from that very primal place of either trying to protect ourselves or trying to get what we think we need to survive, even if over and over again it puts us in a less favorable position. You know, some of these things get hardwired into who we are. The next thing that I want to just say is we're going to go in and talk a bit about the phrases that we use, what you call the archetypes. And, you know, I want to kind of just recognize that, you know, some of the language might not be what you normally or typically hear on the show. But, you know, I think it's really interesting that it's been written in such a graphic way. And I don't think it's unrealistic. I think it's actually very accurate to kind of the language that people might use with themselves or use with others. So let's see how our listeners feel about this. And I think you're going to write in and let us know in studio101@gmail.com. And where I want to go is I actually want to go to some of the positive stuff, because, you know, you do a really good job of outlining the places where, you know, people can get into trouble, or these men can get into trouble. But then you do this beautiful rounding up of strategies that help individuals, you know, kind of come to terms with themselves, do that deep dive. So I want you to know right from the onset that, you know, this is not about bashing men. You know, I just think that that's really important, that we understand that that's not the purpose of this book. Be Less Dickish is not about saying that men somehow are, you know, not our favorite half of the population. Okay. And, you know, just keeping that in mind, also keeping in mind as we talk about some of the stories that David and Corey are going to share, recognize that, you know, these are based on kind of events that you've experienced either in your at your clinic, or I think, Corey, because you are a previous patient, you know, things that you might have lived through. And I think that's really powerful. And it's a testament to actually coming to a place where you want to grow in a way that is profound and frees you up from old patterns and habits. So with that said, and all that, welcome, David and Corey, and thank you so much for joining us. And David, thank you for flying all the way back from Bali to be with us today.
That's committed. Thank you for having us. And yes, Dave, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining the United States, joining our country again.
So I guess I'd like to start with just the title, Be Less Dickish, and these four kind of, in your case, it's like four primary areas that we're going to look at in terms of the places that people can get stuck, but also not. There's one extra one that's true. There is an extra one, and we'll talk about that one as well. So let's go with that. Be less dickish. Why be less dickish, Corey?
So the title "Be Less Dickish" is the title of the book because Dave told me that's what it's going to be. I know. No. But actually, that was the title when I got involved in the book. The manuscript that I wrote had that title. And we went around and wrestled with other possibilities. Even as we were writing, I had different working titles as we worked through the different characters. It was helpful to me to try and picture the book from another person's point of view. I tried to look at the book as if a woman was reading it, as if a guy was reading it. Sometimes my mother was reading what I was writing about myself in there, or like I always was trying to see what it was like from the other side. So we did use working titles along the way. But really, Be Less Dickish had to be the name of the book. One, Dave came up with it and it was brilliant. But more than anything, we wanted to make the point that, yeah, we can do things better. As my son always says, try harder, do better. Next time, try harder, do better. And there really is the tone that we were trying to put in there, is that these are features that apply to all of us. We can do it better. We weren't trying to stick a label on anybody or anything or any movement about something being toxic or not. We were just saying, hey, sometimes we get spun out there where things aren't that great. And we're writing a book about doing it better.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. And what are your thoughts, Dave?
In my mind, there's a lot of self-help books about like cultivating like positive qualities, like, how to be more compassionate, how to be a better man, how to be, a warrior. And I'm not drawn into most self-help books. And I wanted to write a book that basically said, hey, we get triggered and we behave poorly and we know we do it. And the solution can be get to know how you do that, get to know how you get spun out in your life, in what situations, and what happens inside of you when you get spun out, and get in a relationship with that and do it a little less each time. Just like pay attention and just like get into a relationship with yourself where you're working a process. Like, oh, I can feel I just got triggered. I want to kind of pull away and blame. All right, I see that that's happening right now. I want to do something a little bit different this time. So for me, it was a lot about like incremental change, which I think is the only kind of change that's possible. Like get involved, get engaged, and get present, and play with these areas where you struggle, where you go to extremes, where you get spun out.
Okay, that's fantastic. I really appreciate that you're talking about incremental change, because really that's the only thing. I mean, when there are really profoundly deep old wounds, it's only ever incremental, and then it might look like instant success because somebody's worked so hard, and then all of a sudden it's like they move into a really different place of functioning. But that usually comes from incredibly hard work. The men in my practice, and I have a bit of an unusual practice in that largely counseling and psychological practices generally have more female than male clients or patients. And in my practice, I tend to have more male than female patients. And the ones that would fit into this idea of the dickish role often come with the most profound injuries in life and in childhood. And, those triggers that you're talking about are sometimes from wounds that nobody should inflict on a child. But often that's where a lot of those, that level of rapid triggering response comes from. And I also like that you said, we get triggered, we behave badly, and we know it. Because, it really helps to give back the power when we're not pretending that, oh, well, nothing happened there, right? Or it's really all your fault. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to say, yeah, I got that. That was something that was happening inside of me. So congratulations on the book, and also the kind of rawness in which the raw approach in which you have written it. Now, I know the two of you have an interesting story and arrived at writing this together. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that? I think Dave, really, you started working on the manuscript and Corey came in later. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I got the idea about 10 years ago because I heard a lot of the profanity in my therapy office, like guys saying like, oh, I was such an asshole, or that guy's a dick, or, so I got interested in these terms, and they wouldn't leave me alone. So I started researching and writing. And for about 7 years, I was just in this world of this language. And I got to the point where the manuscript was about 160,000 words. It was chaotic, and I just couldn't rein it in. And Corey just kept popping into my head. He would write a ton when we were working together, so I knew he was a brilliant raw writer. And I was also kind of like ethically, like, is this the right thing to do or not? Because we'd ended our therapeutic relationship about 5 years ago, but it stayed in some contact. And I just got clear, like, I think he's the guy. So I just shot it off to him, just thinking maybe like he'd read it, give me some feedback, but I could just feel right away like, oh, he's in. And his wife, Kelly, was in also. So he came in and just really started swinging the sword and cutting the fat and getting the model dialed in. But it was powerful, and it was intense to work in a different capacity, because it was a really different kind of relationship as co-authors, obviously, than it was as client and therapist. So we dove in hard and got it to where it is now, which I'm really proud of what we did.
Wow, that's incredible. And
Anna,
yeah, go ahead, Corey.
So I would say to that, it's interesting that Dave describes that like that, and of all the paragraphs and stories and characters in the book, you came back and kind of led in with a paragraph that always stood out to us too, which is describing that moment where someone is triggered and they, as we said, freak the fuck out. And they will do anything to make that go away and to make that stop. And having worked with Dave and understanding his the concept that he was trying to bring to people in this book about being triggered and about having a reaction to these triggers, that was a core part of what we were trying to keep in the book. And that was a core theme that we wanted in the book, with the characters, with the model, with the approach to dealing with information. We wanted people to know that, yes, you will get triggered and you will freak out, and you will find a way to make that fear or that sense of trauma stop. And, we got to work together, and I was a former patient looking at Dave saying, hey, you were really good at describing this. You were really good as a therapist in helping me see where I was overreacting and where I was just reacting, and where I was actually having a really thoughtful response and making a plan. And I got to explain to Dave, like, you were good at this. You did well. You had a good approach. We're just going to bring the characters up to the level of this instruction to get to the point where we can deal with triggers. And it was hard. It was a hell of a process to do that together, but it was largely along the lines of achieving the goal in the exact paragraph that you pulled out of the book.
Funny. Yeah, listen to your instincts. Never know where it takes you, huh? Corey, I'm just wondering, like, what it was like for you to shift from that role. I mean, there's plenty of time between you working with Dave and then you becoming a co-author. So there's no conflict there, but I just wonder what it must have been like for you to do that.
I would say that it was fun. It was one hell of an adventure, and it was not easy to maintain that in a project. And I had a profound respect for Dave, because after working with him for 7 years, even though we hadn't seen each other, really followed up except a little bit of where we were in the world for a few years before we started writing together, there was a special place in my life for Dave and the work that we'd done together. And we processed a lot. We talked through a lot. A lot of the stories in the book came out of experience that I had on the streets of San Francisco and living in the Bay Area. We kind of adapted them to fit these characters in some places. And so then to go in and work with Dave, like lay it out there and say my piece of it, it was kind of it's kind of a gift, really. Like in the process, I got to look back and think, yeah, we really did talk about some of this stuff. We really did get through this stuff. We really did make this approach the way we're describing it in the book. So that part felt really good. Now, sitting with Dave, who I had this respect for, and he was the professional and I was the flailing client. And then for us to sit down at a book and say, all right, we're going to cut this whole chapter out. Like, I know you worked on this for a few years, Dave, but it ain't going to fit. It doesn't work. We're going to change it. We're taking this whole character out.
I was flailing in the book writing process. So you got to see me and all my shit. Whereas before, as a clinician, like, you don't get to know me and the mess that I can be sometimes. So that was what was really vulnerable for me, is like, you're going to see me, and you did totally.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that is so sweet, because I always think about clients' beliefs and expectations, and like my version of the universe is that, it could, the things that bring people into therapy could happen to any therapist that you work with. And, the truth about our growth and who we are, any therapist worth their salt has to continue doing their own work. And that's just how it's got to be, because otherwise you get sloppy and unclear and dishonest with yourself. So, that's just part of the journey. So that must have been really quite lovely for that to happen then, take down that hat.
There's a funny image that you, having read the book, you can kind of picture this. Well, there's a model to the book. Like, what do you do when you experience these triggers and you're experiencing fear or trauma, or something happens and you're going to make that move? You're about to react. And that's the basis too of the structure of the archetype. And the model is, are you going to act like an asshole, a douchebag, a pussy, a dick? Like, what are you going to do? And so in that process, everyone's asking themselves, like, what am I? Like, what do I do? How do I describe my reaction? In some situations, do I act like an asshole? So here's Dave and I, he's the therapist, I'm the client, and we're asking each other, like, what do you do? Like, like for me to sit there at this table or writing and sharing, like, Dave, in this situation, are you going to act like an asshole? Or are you going to act like a dick? Like, what are you going to do? And, you never get to do that with a therapist when you have a professional relationship. But here we are writing a book, and we kind of had to go through that. It was pretty fun. Like, it was hard, but it was definitely fun and interesting. There's a lot to gain from that.
Maybe a bit therapeutic for you, Corey? So you could see David as more than just the therapist.
Yeah. It's like, Dave, now I'm going to make you cry. Goddamn! Now you cry.
Did he, Dave? Did he?
I don't know if I cried, but I definitely left the room and had to like lay down for an hour when like the character was axed that I had spent like 6 months developing, and he had to go, and it just hurt. So I'd go for a walk. I'd disappear.
Oh, wow. Okay. So let's look a little bit at these quadrants. I've changed them a little bit. You use the primary words, and I have changed them to these four descriptors or douchebag quadrants as aggression, assertiveness. I mean, obviously there's the negative and the positive of each of these. Imitation, service, victimization, self-care, or submission, surrender. Does that fit, do you think?
I mean, that's a big question. Like, what we said is, when you spin out, like in the asshole quadrant, you'll go into aggression. You'll go into kind of a selfish, shameless orientation. But there's also a real appeal to assholes. Like we like Tony Soprano. There's a certain freedom the asshole has that a lot of people don't have, because we're too conscientious about our impact on others. So we say we don't want people to be assholes, but most people need to be more assertive. They need to be able to take themselves into account and be selfish and shameless sometimes and be fully who they are. So the gift of that quadrant is to be able to be assertive, which I think a lot of men need to cultivate that capacity.
Yeah, in a way that is honest, because otherwise you end up having these I mean, what I've seen in clients is that they're busy trying to please, and in the end they're just miserable, and that does not serve any relationship.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, I want to say something about the use of the word pussy. Like that was hours of conversations, but that is the word that showed up in my office again and again. That is the word men use, and it is not a good
on themselves, right? To describe themselves.
Yeah, like it is for kind of a deferential, submissive male, and so many men are afraid of being seen like that. So we just kind of took that word head on, but we did it really respectfully. But we also had to use the word that is the word that's used, at least in the United States.
Oh yeah, we're using the same language here.
Yeah. Okay.
In Canada,
they used it in Bali too, Dave.
Yeah, they did.
You just
so a lot of men will show up, as you said, they're trying to be good guys. But they're ultimately being selfless, and they're being overly conscientious about the way other people feel. So submissiveness isn't good. We need men to be powerful, but being able to surrender and really take in another person and be impacted by life, that's a powerful trait. So again, that's the gift of that quadrant. We don't want men to be submissive, but we want men to be able to surrender to life, to be touched by life, to let other people in deeply, and to be affected.
Yeah, so I think you also both were able to add a lot of humor to each of the stories. Right. And some of the stories were seriously very crass, and like you're describing, people who are behaving in such self-destructive ways. The manner in which they're entering into their lives just seemed to lead them to crumble. And there were a couple of stories like that. Do you have a favorite, Corey?
I'm curious. I do have some favorite stories in there, but I'm curious what stories stood out to you. And I want to. When you say some stood out and some were crass, what stood out to you?
Well, I mean, there were so many different vignettes. I don't think that I have a kind of favorite one, but I just recognize these characters so well, and it just made me feel like I was sitting in a therapy room with a client, as the client's like sitting there shrugging and not really wanting to say anything, and being angry with the therapist when really it's some pain within inside of themselves, that's evoking this silence in the therapy session, or anger towards the therapist when, really what's going on is just real either self-loathing or a deep desire to externalize our pain onto somebody else, or pretend that maybe the relationship that is crumbling, that doesn't matter at all. Like there's an example of that relationship that was crumbling, the man who finds himself in a relationship with two women at the same time, and it starts to come to the light of day, and then he realizes, what have I just done? What am I doing? Like, I'm destroying my life.
So what you're describing, I guess, the different vignettes, it's great. Like you see these characters in these different settings. Like sometimes they're with their families, and sometimes they're sitting privately in front of Dave in a therapy session, and they just melt down. And you get to see the world through their eyes. You get to see how they describe the world, and you get to see how they experience the world as it's happening to them and what their reactions are. So there's a lot of them. There's a little bit of me in all of these characters. I would say there are times where I was an investment banker for 14 years. I don't look like an investment banker. I don't act like an investment banker, but I looked the part. I went to work. I tried it on. I felt like wearing a costume at times, and it didn't work. And I worked with people who were able to achieve that and do very well. There are times where I didn't really stick it for my own interests or hobbies or pursuits or desires or anything, and it's kind of let everyone else determine the ride. And some of that is written into George, the pussy character. So for me, there's a lot of these stories like that were personal in how they were written. But if I look back and think about any that stood out, there's one, and I don't want to give too much detail because it's towards the end. And it's one that Dave and I really worked on towards the end of the book as well. And it's the realization with the douchebag, his character's name is Jed, finally has to come to grips with the calamity of his life just coming to a head. And it wasn't just that he was a liar. He might not have been. He might have been sincere. It was that he wasn't living a life that was sustainable. He wasn't living a life that was authentic. He wasn't living a life for his own benefit. It appeared selfish, but he was just discarded himself. And he finally had to face these consequences and the losses. And it kind of came to a head in a conversation with his grandpa, of all people, who was not even living independently at the time. And I think that is one that has stood out to me. And it's surprising how many adult men have come to me and said, that story, that particular one, made me cry.
Yeah, there's a really interesting section in the book with it's on page 121. Jed is spun out in imitation, and he shows up for a therapy session. And he says, I think I've basically got my shit totally together. Sorry, I missed a few appointments. Mostly I just came in to talk for a bit, undermining what you're really achieving, and it's way beyond talk. Maybe we shouldn't schedule anything anymore. You've been busy. I know I need to pay you for the missed sessions. Not a lot going on. And Dave is like, have a seat, man, Jed, and you're wanting him to stay with it. And eventually you say to him, what's really going on? And when things are really bad, who do you have to talk to? Who can you be real with? And I cannot tell you how many men I work with who say to me, absolutely no one, absolutely no one. And this, I think, is a cultural failing, because for some reason, we have not created a culture that allows for the soft, sweet, honest truth of the pain that everybody lives with. I mean, women have a lot more leeway on this. I've got a bunch of friends who I can say all sorts of stuff to and be vulnerable with, and I don't feel like I'm going to be shaming myself in doing it. I know that they're gonna accept me being sad or having a tearful moment, and I know my husband will do that with me as well. But sometimes I see that the male friends that I have, they don't give themselves that same leeway. They've learned that it's not acceptable, or that nobody should ever see that level of pain, or that they don't have a right to it. And I just think it's very, very problematic.
In this case with Jed, and in the story you're describing, in that experience, as we describe it, Dave challenges him. I think you're 120 pages into the book, so you're pretty far into the development of these characters. Mm-hmm. And that's the point. And Dave really says to him, who really knows you? Who really knows you? And he gets to the point where Jed doesn't even understand the voices in his own damn head. He certainly hasn't let his own family and the people he works with, and certainly not a partner of any kind, in. And if you look at all of these characters, that we had to bring them to a point where Dave, the therapist and character, he's a writer, a character, a narrator, he's everything in this book. You're everything, man. Dave, you are the everyman. So he gets to the point, he has to challenge the pussy too. He has to challenge the asshole even though it's the asshole who's trying to bring the leverage to that meeting. Like there's a point where it comes to a head and where there has to be a decision. Like, am I going to make a step? Am I going to take a single step forward in the right direction? And I hope that's a takeaway that everyone has from the book. Like everyone, no matter what your inclination is when you're up against the wall, you got to take a step forward. You got to make a trip. You got to try and move towards the center.
Anna, what you're both saying along the line, like the Walt Whitman quote, "Most men live lives of quiet desperation." Like that was a big inspiration for me starting the book. Is like what you're saying, Anna. Like men are so trapped inside. They're so caught in the role of how they think they need to be, and they're suffering in there, and they're trying really hard to keep that going. And in that moment in the book with Jed the douchebag, I'm like, who really knows you? And he finally snapped. He says, no one. Okay. Are you happy? Like no one. And and then all of it comes pouring out in that moment of like the reality of his life and the pain that he's in.
The other thing that I want to raise, and I think it's very, very important in having a dialogue like this, there is nothing instant about these profound levels of change. Corey, you said you were working with David for 7 years.
Yeah, that's kind of embarrassing. And
it is so
it
beautiful.
took me a while to come around.
I cannot tell you how impressive it is, how incredible it is that you had the tenacity, the courage. Because like I see with the clients that I work with, the male clients that I work with, the level of courage that is needed to pull yourself away from notions of what you think you're supposed to be in this culture and say, you know what, I'm going to do the deep dive. I'm going to do this work. And sometimes clients get frustrated in a year or two, like, especially when, these personality structures are so rigidly embedded. The ego structure is there in order to keep us safe. It's not going to go away easily. So, when clients show up and they have very, very kind of deeply set injuries, ego structure is rigid and it does take years. And the fact that you had that kind of courage to stay with it, Corey, like huge applause.
Thank you.
I just think it's incredible. I want to read some of the emails that are coming in so that we get a sense of what our listeners are talking about.
This is going to be fun.
Yeah, this is the first one. Now, this is really interesting. This is from Steve, and Steve says, hello, Dr. Baranowski. Does the book discuss alpha and beta males? Now, let me just give an explanation to our listeners about what that actually is. Generally, this is a term that comes from what's known as the manosphere communities, in which they believe that men who are deemed alpha males are preferred by women, and men that are given the term beta males are taken advantage of or ignored by women. Now, I think these terms are so problematic because, for one thing, what seems to happen is there's this lie where I guess people in the manosphere really don't have the scope to understand that is not what women are looking for here. It's not the way it plays out. So, I think what you're doing with Be Less Dickish frees up these men from this notion of the manosphere terms alpha and beta males. But now maybe you can help me to understand from your perspective, David and Corey, what you think about that.
Yeah, I like what you said.
I got a lot to say on this one, Dave. So give it a rip and I'll follow you.
Yeah, I'll try to be concise. I want men with a lot of accessibility. So, if you're going to go out and play basketball, you want to be able to be aggressive. You want to be able to play hard in that context. I also want men to be able to be soft and vulnerable with their children and be vulnerable with their partners. I want them to be in a kind of a leadership role with family. I want them also to be able to kind of surrender to the ride of their partners and their woman and honor her. So I'm more about versatility and capacity, and for men to be able to experience themselves very differently in different contexts and have the full spectrum of life experiences than I am wanting men to be like in an alpha orientation, like as a general sense of identity. Corey, tag.
I hear these concepts like alpha and beta, and I would challenge them and say, how is this any different than taking the population of men in the world and dividing them up by blueberry and raspberry. And we went through this in writing the book, and I would challenge Dave over and over and over in the words and the paragraphs and even the grammar, how it was set up. Are you describing this with a metaphor? Because if you are, you're not really describing it. And that's what you have when you try and divide the population to alphas and betas. You're using a metaphor. And the book has really taken this to the next level and said, all right, what is it exactly that you're describing or experiencing or doing? And that's why it's important to say, or is it an aggressive move? Is it an assertive move? Or is it just alpha? Because we can distinguish the difference. We can say to people, this is someone who, when they're really up against it, they're triggered or they're getting a lot of information, they have to make decisions. They can make themselves the priority, or they can make someone else the priority. They can make their own interests the priority, or the company, or the family, or their partner's interests the priority. And when people get away from the metaphors of what is toxic or not toxic, alpha or beta, left or right, or white and black, and all of these just random definitions and metaphors that don't mean anything, then they can achieve or find a place where they can make a better decision with real information. So on the alpha and beta thing, that is why we wrote the book. We wanted people to understand what it is that they are doing and what they are experiencing with these men. It is a book about men, not just for men. And I think
the thing that I find interesting, and maybe this is a really good book for Steve to read, maybe, because, it goes way beyond those terms,
generalities,
and gives a huge range in which to understand oneself and to challenge rigidly held beliefs. This one is from Walt, and Walt says, "Hi Anna, I listened to most of your shows on Reality Radio 101, and I must admit this is by far the most interesting today. Thanks for the knowledge and the humor." Well, that's really cheers to you, David and Corey. So that's excellent. Here is another. Hey, this is from Tammy, who says, "Hey doctor, whose body is on the cover?"
All right, you want the answer?
Yeah, you know what? I
will tell you straight up the answer. It's David's body. Literally, that is David's body.
The statue of David.
Yes, David's body, the statue of David, perfect in every possible way.
Yes.
Okay.
We had to actually buy the rights to that picture. And this is funny because obviously you can see now that it's Michelangelo's David, right?
Yeah.
And we had to buy the rights to use it on the book, which we did. Well, and it came back to us in the form of the cover. We're working with the editors and publishers to get it done right. Well, then we had to modify it slightly for hardback and modify it slightly for an ebook. So they sent me the raw picture after we'd worked on the design. I'm like, man, that is kind of a close up of a really explicit statue. So we'd already put the book out and I'd never seen it that close up without the black box. And it just made me laugh. I just cracked up.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, there you go. Thank you, Michelangelo. This is from Kelly, and you'll remember, David and Corey, that before the show, we were trying to deal with the language issue. Like, should you, just go with it and use the words that you're using in your book, or, hold ourselves back, or, what we were going to do. And I said, maybe we'll let our intelligent listeners kind of tell us what they think. And obviously what they think is they're perfectly fine with it, because we've had not one emails suggesting that people are frustrated or they don't like the language or anything like that. So don't you think that's interesting? Like it's a non-issue, and it's language as we would normally hear it. It's not, it's not put on in some way. This is what you actually hear in normal conversation. This is how people talk to themselves, right?
Yeah,
this is from Kelly, and she just says, "Hey, what a show today, loving it."
Yeah, we didn't want to, the book isn't careful. Like, we didn't write like a flowery self-help book. And as Corey's saying, like, we didn't want to get lost in abstraction. It's experiential. What is the experience you're actually having? Not what you think about it, what category you think, like what's actually happening in the moment in your life, and addressing things at that level. Like a good therapy session, like you're going to be in the here and now with your life and yourself. Like that's what we wanted the book to be.
Yeah, the heat of all of that really occurs.
And then Dave, I would say this, Dave, about that. Sorry, Anna, but get back to Kelly's point is, one of the most important parts of this was dealing with the concept of triggers. And, we went around and around with the names, like, what are we going to do? Can we really put douchebag on here and pussy? We know we can't put them on the cover of the book, but we got to use these words because nothing else works. Well, then we went through the same process with the description of the model of the behavior and had to ask, what is a trigger? Like, what is it? It's used in so many ways in the world out there. And we really were firm in writing the book that triggers are information. Triggers don't have feelings. They're not living. They're not alive. This is when we experience information or a form of a trigger, just having the ability of addressing it for what it is without a metaphor and not giving it more power than it actually has, and just say, all right, I just got this information. What am I going to do? That was helpful. And we did the same thing with describing the person. This person is aggressive. We're going to call him an asshole, but we're really telling you that's aggression. You're dealing with aggression. And it just kind of took the edge off of a lot of those words, doing it that way.
Yeah. I want to go into kind of some of the self-talk, or what you called self-told excuses that are cliches. These are things that I think, a lot of people say to themselves, but in your book, this is what the men are saying to themselves. Don't embarrass yourself. You already had a good life. What will people think? Just be grateful for what you have. You're going to feel stupid with your track record. Why risk it? It's none of your business. Someone else can do it better. And then kind of how that plays out with these 4 archetypes that you're seeing, these distinct archetypes that you're seeing in the clients that you've worked with: asshole, douchebag, pussy, dick. But you move it forward into this strategy called trace. Can you talk a little bit about trace?
Yes. Trace is kind of the active part of the process, where we basically say the T and the R in trace are triggers and reactivity. Triggers and reactions. And that's what most people are stuck in their life. They get triggered and they react in these habituated ways. And when it happens long enough, you get rigidified into one of these kind of 4 characters if you're not careful. So triggers, reaction, repeat. That's the same thing. So the ace in the trace is awareness. Whoa, I'm triggered, and I'm doing that thing that I do when I'm triggered. Like, my partner just took a tone with me and I'm kind of shutting down and wanting to pull away. Right? That's the awareness piece. That's what's happening. Curiosity. How interesting that I'm doing that thing. What's getting touched in me? I'm curious about my experience. I'm curious about the way that I'm wanting to react. And then experimentation is the action part. The action part is like, how do I want to show up differently? How do I want to experiment and do something else this time in my life and see what happens? So to me, trace is a very kind of active way to engage life. It's one of self-reflection, one of curiosity, and then one of experimentation.
Yeah, it's nice that, you've got this frame almost. If somebody wanted to really do their inner work and, put up a poster that said trigger, reaction, awareness, curiosity, experiment, so that they would know anytime they felt themselves slipping into a place where they were really not happy with their behavior, or things were really not unfolding in a meaningful way, that they could start to really reflect on it through this lens, that trace lens. I like it. And then that takes us a little bit. Yeah, go ahead, Corey.
So we keep going back to this, but you take the opening paragraph that you read about people being in that place where they freak out, right? They're so triggered, they're going to do what they always do. And Dave makes an incredible point here and throughout the book, and about all of these extreme reactions, whether it's aggression, submission, victimization, imitation, all of the four extremes. These people go to that habitually, chronically. They don't even think about it anymore. This is just what they do. And like you say, based on your practice and trauma, like Dave describes, like I learned from experience, from listening to smart people like you guys, the reason people keep going back to those awful behaviors or extreme behaviors is because it worked.
It does.
It works. If the goal is to make the pain stop, make the discomfort stop, make the sadness stop, or the fear or the risk or any kind of vulnerability that is a threat to them, and they want it to stop, they go to those behaviors because it works, and it has always worked for them. And it may have been conditioned from the time they were 3. It may have had roots something later in their teens, in their adult life, almost to a rule. It goes back to something, and it worked. And the trace method is Dave's way, and it works on me. It worked with me of going in and saying, do you see the information that you got? Do you see your response? Can you ultimately see a pattern? To the point where you're aware, like, holy shit, I keep doing the same goddamn thing no matter what. Every time, maybe there's a better way.
Maybe.
But in the meantime, I'm probably going to repeat the bad behavior. I'm still going to go break something. I'm still going to go hurt something. I'm still going to disappoint somebody. I'm still going to blame somebody. But I'm starting to think like, maybe there's a plan B. And that's the point of this whole book, is we want people to see these characters who are like hurting, not just hurting being hurt. They're actually hurting people. Mm-hmm. They are hurting people. And they have to come to the realization that what I'm doing, it isn't just to relieve my pain. I'm actually creating a consequence somewhere that ain't pretty, and it ain't good, and it feels like shit. And that's the point of trace, is that awareness of like, whoa, hang on, maybe something could be better. I'll try a different way.
Corey, I'm wondering, because I think Dave and you had mentioned your wife or partner in life. I wonder what she witnessed in the 7 years that you were working with Dave, until you got to a point where you were no longer in sessions. What kind of feedback did you get from her about how this trace approach and the work that you were doing with David in terms of increasing your self-awareness? What would she say about that? What kind of feedback did you get from her?
You're going to get now we're in therapy here. Here we go.
Okay.
So when I started with Dave, I was married. I worked with Dave through a divorce. I worked with Dave being a single dad. I worked with Dave, like walking away from Wall Street and not being an investment banker or an analyst anymore, and starting a new career in the trades. I worked with Dave through the highs and lows and success and failures, and ended up single dad in San Francisco with 3 kids, wondering what the hell could possibly get worse. How could I mess this up anymore? When Dave and I started writing the book together, at that point, I'd reconnected with Kelly, who I'm married to now, who we actually dated in high school, went our separate ways. Was remarried, living on a ranch, restoring tractors and running around with dogs and horses and cats and kids, and didn't think I'd ever get involved in anything complicated ever again. And life was great. Like, I felt like I'd kind of turned the page and we were off to the races. And then when I described reading the manuscript like you did out loud in a car, that was with my current wife, Kelly, and I was blown away by it. And she was too. And we knew that it needed a lot of work. We were willing to get involved and told Dave we would. But it was a profound experience. When you ask like what my wife's view or experience was with the change and the development and all of these models and characters, she's been in it as thick as Dave and I. She's been involved from the get-go on the model, on the characters, the development of the characters. She was a powerful influence on a few of the characters that we ended up cutting from the book and some that we added to the book. And she and I talk about this model and trace and where we are when we get triggered by each other and other things all the time. It is a core part of our conversations and our relationship at this point. So she would say it's affected us and changed us. And I would bet she would say it's affected Dave and changed him too. She's had a lot of conversations with Dave in this process along the way. I think it's anyone who puts this level of work into a model like we did and into a book like we did, and these raw stories and characters is going to be affected by it.
Wow, that's really a beautiful story. It just wove itself right in, and you really take it seriously. It's like you're trying to really live it.
Yeah, if you've read the book, you'll see that there's obviously the main characters. That the asshole character is named Jonah, and George is the pussy. Like there's these main characters, but they all have partners. They all have work associates. They might have kids. They're unique. They're real people. And the characters that are experiencing the ride of these extreme people or men, they also become very real. And, partway through the book, we kind of flip the whole thing, as you notice, and we right almost dead center of the book, we take all of these people and roll them up a little bit and let you see them from the woman's point of view, from a wife's point of view, from a co-parenting point of view. And you get to feel really the trauma that this shitty, awful, extreme behavior can inflict on another person. Some of those men wouldn't know what was happening. And it ain't fun. And there's been more than a few people read this book and get to those characters and the view from the women and just be like, that was a little too real. Like that was hot and it hit a little too close to the bone or the heart. And I think that we need that. And, my wife was a core part in developing those characters.
I'm sorry that we didn't have her on today then.
You got plenty of calls in the future. She'll put these headphones on, sit right here and jump on there. She's
well, let's plan that for some time in the new year so that we can have another conversation about this topic and how it plays out. And one of the earlier emails we got came from Hans, and Hans says, "Hello, Bear Psychology." That's the name of my company. "I can't wait for the follow-up book for women. Be less of a pussy." Honest to God, this is actually a email. And here's another one. This one's from James, who says, "Hello, folks. Today is actually National Coffee Day. I'm listening to your show, and I just drank a pot of coffee, laughing my ass off." So you can see that you're hitting a chord today. Any final words that you'd like to share with our listeners? And by the way, I want to just thank both of you so much for making this a great show and being such wonderful guests.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, here's my final word. To me, I wrote the book with women in mind as well, because I think women are taught to kind of indulge bad male behavior. And the book says very specifically to women, like, hey, recognize this behavior in men and call it out for what it is. Like, hold your center. Don't get spun out by the pussy who wants you to take care of him, or the dick who says that he's the victim. Don't get spun out by this behavior. Like, hold men to account, invite men into their center. So I just wanted to say that the book is about men, but women that have read the book have loved it because it gives them a language for like the baffling male behavior. Like it helps women understand male behavior so they can speak to it, so they can hold their center, so they can demand something more from men other than just the spun out stuff that they might have gotten used to.
Right. Corey?
I would say in closing that if anybody reads this book and has any questions about the process or the characters, they can always find us. They can email us on our website, www.belessdickish.com. You can find us. I will respond and answer any questions. So if there's some we didn't get to here, no problem. We'll get to them. I want to address, I think it was Hans, you said about be less of a pussy.
Right.
I hope people read this book and walk away with one of the messages we have in there, and that is that the pussy in this book and in this model is actually one of the absolute strongest characters. And what we describe these characters as their priorities, of whether they themselves are a priority or other people. It takes a lot of strength to make someone else the priority all the time, and to actually care about making them a priority all the time. That is hard. That is heavy. Just smashing, breaking, and blaming and pretending is not as heavy and not as hard as actually submitting and giving everything away all the time. So I hope that people walk away from this and realize that there really is a complex model to humans and relationships, but we can make it practical. And that's what we try and do in this book, and why we use the words that we use to just make the conversation practical, helpful, and hopefully a few people get to laugh their asses off, because it really is a fun book.
Well, it certainly is. I want to thank both of you for joining us today again, and all of our listeners. Thanks so very much. You'll be hearing from me again. And for all our listeners, have a gentle day. Be well, guys. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.